Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Abigail Shrier, author of new book, Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. We spoke about why therapy culture is so damaging, particularly to children, why it seems to have taken hold of America and whether that might have something to do with atomization, family disintegration, a whole bunch of factors. In the extended part of the episode, we also spoke about the plague of gentle parenting and why parenting gurus are so attractive, particularly via social media. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where, as always, you can also find the chat community, the bonus episodes I do fortnightly with my husband, and the whole back catalogue of extended episodes. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Abigail, should we start by talking about something which I wasn't really aware of until I read your book, and I don't think the vast majority of the public are aware of, which is the iatrogenic effects of psychotherapy.
Iatrogenesis just is a Greek word. It just means when a healer introduces harm. And we know that any intervention, by definition, any intervention from Tylenol to x-rays, that has the power to do good, has the power to heal, also by definition has the power to harm, right? You don't want to get exposed to too much radiation. So if you don't need an x-ray, don't get one. And you don't want to be exposed to the infections in an emergency room. So if you don't need to go to hospital, don't go. And the same is true of psychotherapy. I never deny that it is a powerful intervention. I believe that it both is powerful and that it can be really helpful and even, essential for people. But then we have to acknowledge that it can also introduce harm, and it does in a significant number of patients. And the point of the book, of course, is not to suggest that no one should ever get therapy or even that no child should, but just that it does introduce risks. And I believe that's what we're seeing in the rising generation.
I gotta say, I read it and I was like, I don't have that much interaction with teenagers at this point in my life. So maybe this is worse in Britain than I realize. But I did read it and I was like, America has gone completely bananas. You give these examples of kids being taken to weekly therapy from the age of 4 or 5 or being given like prophylactic therapy just in case they find going to high school difficult, or just people deploying this and spending so much money on therapy for their children when there isn't even a real problem.
Right. So even our school system, it's been brought in through our schools. So the mental health staffs are expanded in every public school. So public school, being your state schools. And so you have a lot of people dabbling in therapy with children. So not even just the parents who are affluent enough to take their kids to therapy, but even ones who show up for school, or parents who read the therapist written parenting books and are trying out a kind of therapy in place of discipline with their children. So these kids are absolutely inundated with psychopathology. They are understanding themselves with the language of psychopathology. You never hear an American teenager or kid anymore say that they're worried. They're always anxious. It's always my anxiety. They never say sad. They're always depressed. They never say that, they went through a hard time. They say they have PTSD. So they're really understanding themselves in the language of psychopathology.
And I guess what a lot of sort of lay defenders of psychotherapy would say is, well, how can it cause any harm? You're just talking, you're just providing a listening ear, etc. But the argument you make very convincingly is that actually there's loads of harm that you can cause through therapy. It might not be the like opportunistic infection you get from unnecessary surgery or whatever. It's psychological harm, but it's serious harm.
Sure. I mean, just think about it, right? You can, in talking about and affirming a child's fear, you can make the fear worse. You can exaggerate it. So you say, if a child says, I'm scared of the dog next door, I don't want to go there. Now, most good parents know what actually the research shows, which is exposure therapy is the way to do. You make a child go and you show her that there's no reason to be afraid of the dog. But if she sits down with a therapist and the therapist says, oh, that must have been so scary for you. How big was the dog? The child is likely to come away with an even more, stronger phobia. And we see that therapy, there's great literature on this. Therapy can exaggerate, worries, fears, cause depression to get worse. We see this with all kinds of patients, burn victims, who went to psychotherapy versus the control group, first responders who went to psychotherapy after a traumatic incident versus the control group, breast cancer survivors who went through psychotherapy versus the control group. In every case, they ended up worse off with worse symptoms, with more anxiety, with more depression, or more PTSD than the control, because psychotherapy can make symptoms worse, and it can also introduce new symptoms.
And it's such a countercultural insight, right? Because it's so much you particularly hear this in relation to men's mental health. Certainly in this country, I'm sure in America too, that the kind of folk wisdom about why men have worse, say, suicide rates and other kinds of bad mental health outcomes is because men don't talk about it. And that if only we could get people to talk more about their feelings, ideally in a professional setting, this would resolve it. And what's being suggested here is actually, no, it will probably do the opposite, it will probably make it worse.
That's right. There's so many fantasies that go unquestioned, these, maxims that go unquestioned. You always need to talk about every problem. Well, it's not true. The research doesn't, back it up. Some people actually know that they don't want to relive a traumatic experience, and they do much better by not readdressing it. And but we nonetheless cling to this fantasy that everyone always needs to talk about a sad time, and that there's no inopportune time to talk about it, even with school children in the middle of their school day. That seems like a perfectly good time to revisit their parents' divorce. And of course, that's actually a ridiculous, it's a ridiculous idea, on its face. But, American media has been committed to this idea for so long, from Good Will Hunting to The Sopranos, that nobody questions it anymore. It's like the idea, like, if you swallow a poison, you have to cough it up. And there's this, and that's what they do. The proponents of these ideas, they make a lot of headway by slipping between metaphor and actual scientific suggestion. So they'll say, well, you've got sort of the toxic of your trauma, now you have to cough it up. But it's never clear, are they speaking metaphorically, or are they actually claiming that everyone needs to share their trauma in order to get past it? Because the latter claim is just false.
The funny thing about The Sopranos representation of therapy, right, which in some ways is, yes, it's all about like these tough men, like they need to open up, whatever. But Tony gets worse from therapy. Like the idea that it makes him like a better person. It doesn't. If anything, what's in the impression imprinting, when the therapist gets really like breaks down the boundaries. I can't remember the technical language, but his therapist clearly, whose name I now forget, his therapist clearly is like seduced by him. He just doubles down on all of his terrible behavior. And it's in some ways like a sort of beautiful representation of therapy gone completely wrong.
Well, a lot of people get worse in therapy. I mean, this happens, right? There's really good research on this. And I kind of, we all have certain prejudices. And my prejudice in general is that adults can be trusted to know what's good for them. So if you believe you need therapy, some people objectively need an intervention, but if you believe you would be helped by therapy and you sign up for therapy and there are things you want to work on, I'm all in favor of that, right? First of all, but what I wanted people to know with the book is it's an entirely different situation putting a child in therapy. And the reason is, if a therapy isn't working for a child, if a child is not in a position to say things like, I think we're putting a little too much blame on my mom, or I wouldn't call my parents toxic. That doesn't seem right. Or I don't think that qualifies as emotional abuse. My dad just wasn't thinking when he said that, or something. Those aren't things a child is normally going to say. So you're and there's no oversight, right? Nobody is measuring, oh, is the child's anxiety now worse? Is their depression worse? And here's what I'm most concerned about. Is their sense of inefficacy worse? We have a generation that has an external locus of control, meaning they don't believe they can make a positive difference in their own lives more than we've ever seen before. These kids feel incapacitated, and the habit of reporting everything to an adult, an expert, that is exactly what you would expect to see. Kids who feel like they can't manage just mundane conflicts of teenagehood on their own.
A clinical psychologist that you speak to at one point in this book made a point I never thought about before, but is actually completely intuitive, which is that sending really quite young children, let's say a 4-year-old, to CBT therapy. Now, CBT, my understanding, is one of those forms of therapy that actually has good evidential backing. You can use good CBT techniques, in the right circumstances, can be really helpful. In a sense, of course, what we're actually seeing is sort of almost anti-CBT, right? Infecting the culture, in that we're encouraged to double down on bad emotions and so on. But the point he makes is the techniques can be really good, but you can't teach them to a 4-year-old. You can't say to a 4-year-old, like, if you're in a position where you're thinking like this, you can deploy this technique, because they just don't have the emotional regulation necessary to utilize those tools. Their parents might. So if you taught the parents, if your child is in this state, then you can help them in this way, then that might be helpful. But the idea of having that kind of one-to-one therapeutic relationship with a child, as you would with a parent, is madness when you really think about it.
Yes, I mean, the idea being that a child's not going to remember, a week later, which techniques he or she was supposed to use. Now, let me just say, a lot of people claim to be doing cognitive behavioral therapy who aren't. So I'm always afraid to overpraise it, because I think some of its techniques have been very effective, and especially for people who really trained in its rigors. But because everyone knows it's the only area, it's one of the few therapies with a proven evidence base behind it, everyone claims to be doing it, even people who really aren't. And there's actually good research to that as well. So, but you're right. I mean, most therapists with kids are they're not even, they're not there to address a phobia. They're not there to address a concrete problem. So what naturally happens is this sort of amorphous, tell me about the pain in your life, because the things that make you happy, there's not that much to talk about, right? So inevitably it goes to the negative. And then you have a child looking for something to please the adult with. What can I do to capture her interest? And here's the other thing. Everything a child brings up that is a source of pain is something that's likely to, there's no end to how long they can sit with it or rehash it, because the therapist is there to keep going. See, if a child goes to her aunt or grandma and says, I'm really upset, mom really hurt my feelings, or I felt bad when someone did something to me, your aunt or your grandmother, they don't have an incentive to keep you talking about it endlessly. They'll tell you what they think. Most cases, they love you. They love the child. They want what's best, but they aren't there to rehash this weekly. And there's a really bad incentive going on now with therapy, and that every therapist is incentivized to treat the least sick for the longest period of time, because no one wants to treat the people with severe disorders, or very few people want to. It's really hard to treat those who really need it. It's much more work. And here's the thing, with an adult, let's say they come with a serious disorder. Let's say they come and they want therapy for any reason. They've made that decision, so they're prepared to work. But with a child, a therapist almost always needs to pander, because they're being pushed there by an adult. So now you have a situation in which the therapist sort of has to flatter the child to get her buy-in or his buy-in.
If you're being cynical as a therapist, and it's hard to avoid this if you're having to think about how to pay the bills, is what you really want is someone who comes to you every week forever, right? That's That's great. If you can have a full schedule of those kind of patients, then you're away.
especially someone who doesn't really need it. I have a little social anxiety. I mean, I talked to this young woman, and this, there were a lot of, I talked to many, many, many young people, but this one young woman I thought really just nailed it. She's, I call her Becca in the book. She's been in therapy since she was 6 because her parents divorced, and sort of, every kid is, not every kid, but almost every kid where the parents divorced, they're told therapy, you need therapy if your parents divorced. So she was. I was meeting her at 17. She had been in therapy ever since. And what was she working on now? She was getting ready to go to university and she was preparing to make friends. Her therapist was helping her by talking through the process of making friends. Now, you understand, I mean, that is treatment dependency. That is one of the classic side effects of therapy. Young adults believing they can't do for themselves without checking in with an expert. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing young people who cannot handle the basic tasks of adulthood.
Do you think that some of these young people, so thinking about divorce, for instance, as a factor, do you think that some of these young people are desperate for confiding adult relationships? I was so struck once when I saw this ad for Better Help, the I'm sure you know, the like remote therapy service, which advertises on every podcast except mine. And there was a young woman who was talking about what she got from the service, basically. And she was a young Black American woman. And she was saying that one of the things she really liked about this is she got to choose her therapist based on kind of identity characteristics. And what she wanted was like an older Black American woman to be her therapist. But obviously, what's great about the BetterHelp therapeutic relationship is you can just turn this person off. Like, you can see them when you want to. There's no sense of obligation, whatever. And I thought, what she wants is an aunt or a mum or a grandmother, or
That's
like
right.
that's what she's craving. And
It's
I
her dream mom. Yeah,
exactly. And I wondered, if do you think as maybe extended families are getting more atomized, as the more broken fact, do you think that some of what's going on here is young people craving those relationships that they don't have in their families?
that's right. We need them. We actually need these relationships, and we don't supply them to kids anymore in the same ways. People live far from grandparents and their parents and families and whatnot. They're having fewer children. So they don't have cousins and sisters and siblings around. And here's the thing, you want people who care about you. There's so much good research on this. People you love and who love you back over a lifetime, that's a necessity for human happiness and contentment. But here's the thing, unlike an aunt or a friend who'll basically, listen, want what's best for you, but won't keep it going forever. A therapist is never going to cut you off. And so they have every incentive to say, let's talk about that. I mean, I talked to one woman who cut off her daughter's therapist when she found out that the girl had been engaging in some minor cutting, which of course is very common today in teenager girls. It wasn't serious, but it scared her parents, and they signed her up for a therapist. And the mother finally, the girl was 15 years old, and the mother finally caught it off when she found out for 6 months they had been rehashing a relationship that the girl had had with a boy for 2 weeks before he
Oh.
dumped her. And and now the girl had thought of it as her trauma. And that her PTSD, and her mother thought, this is insane. It was not a big deal. And what I want people to know is it's not just the kids in therapy who are getting this, right? It really has leached into the cultural bloodstream. Everyone believes that sitting around rehashing your pain is the way to get over it. And of course, the research shows the reverse. Rumination, or endlessly dwelling on a past pain, is a classic symptom of depression. We are inducing kids into habits of depressed and unwell people. So unsurprisingly, they don't think of themselves as well. And less than half of them in America believe their mental health is good.
Where do you think this idea has come from that rumination is actually good for you? It's so entrenched. How did
It is.
everyone collectively come up with the idea that this was good?
It's a good question. I think a few things. A lot of the people giving therapy are not terribly educated in terms of the research. I mean, you have practitioners in America all over who have 1-year degrees. They just don't know the research on things like rumination. And I find, less mischief in general seems to be made by psychologists who have PhDs. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be captured and subject to, that there hasn't been all kinds of political capture and whatnot. But in general, when you're dealing with a therapist or a school counselor who believes that talking about problems or, frankly, dabbling in a kid's trauma before math class is a perfectly legitimate and helpful thing to do, they just sometimes don't know the research, and they don't seem very interested in questioning it often. I mean, most people with an ounce of sense would think, gosh, I really don't want to revisit a time when a child was in pain right before she has to do something really hard, like make a new friend or take a history exam or whatever. But here's the thing. When you have these social emotional learning in schools, when you have coping techniques and wellness techniques and anti-bullying techniques taught in schools, what I want people to know is you can be well-meaning, but inevitably you're going to end up doing exercises that rehash kids' past pain. Why? Because you're teaching coping techniques. And if you're going to sit around and talk about just the good things that happen, okay, let's talk about that time you got ice cream after school. There's not much to talk about when it comes to coping techniques. So invariably, the exercise always involves, let's talk about a time when you felt sad, hurt, or upset. Now let's share. Well, now you're in a competition to outshare the others on a more tragic moment and painful moment. This is the opposite of what we should be doing if we wanted healthy, happy kids.
You write as well about group therapy having this tendency to like drag everyone down to the emotional level of the most despondent person in the room, that it is like the low mood is infectious as well within the group.
Yes. I mean, you just think about it, you don't, your friend just shared a painful moment. You don't want to say, oh, really? Your parents got divorced? My parents have a great marriage. You want to match her if you're a nice person. Well, and unfortunately, it leads kids to amplify, and it may even alter their memories, because memories are very suggestible too. So now they're looking, they want to be kind, and they're looking for a past pain, and they're very likely to amp it up, but they may even come to believe it. And you have the mandate of teachers now all across America is trauma-informed care, meaning we're going to treat every child as if she or he may be traumatized. And of course, this is a really good way to induce a sense of trauma, a sense of incapacity, a sense of depression in kids.
I'm really interested as well in how girls are particularly susceptible to this, because it does seem to be consistently the case that girls are more, I don't quite want to use the word vulnerable. Girls are more susceptible to this trend that you're describing. Although you did point out, which I found sort of darkly funny, that liberal boys have worse mental health than conservative girls, even though, because there are two things going on. There's a sex gap and there's also a politics gap, right? So, but basically liberal girls are the like runaway leaders in having terrible mental health. Some of it a lot of it seems to be mimetic among the girls. So some of the girls you speak to have quite good insight, and they say, well, look, it's kind of a way of building friendships, is, I share my trauma with you. This is often through WhatsApp or messaging. It's not face to face. She talks about her trauma. It's kind of there's some social prestige. There's some girl to girl bonding going on. Like, they have social incentives to play this stuff up.
That's right. So I interviewed a woman named Amanda Rose, who's a academic psychologist. And what she told me was that, and she has a lot of research on this, that co-rumination, meaning ruminating together, dwelling together on a past hurt or injury, is actually part of female friendship. It's a classic style of female friendships. Let's sit together and talk about our pain, and let me take on your pain. And that's why girls tend to spread social contagions. It isn't enough to listen and say, wow, that's terrible. Girls want you to take it on. Oh, that's awful. I hate him too. They want you to meet them and take on their pain. And unfortunately, a girl who's willing to take on her friend's pain is much more likely to become depressed herself if she's taking on her friend's sadness. So it is more natural to girls. Now, what about that research showing that boys from liberal families have worse mental health from girls from conservative families. I think it's really interesting. And one of my favorite things about it, one, it shows it's not just social media. We know girls are on way more social media than boys across the board. And second of all, we know it's environmental. We know it's something to do with the life we've given them. It's not an organic phenomenon, this decline in mental health, because it should be across the board, right? It's not in the drinking water. It's something to do with the way we're raising kids. Now, I hypothesize in the book that basically, conservative families are more likely to be religious. They're much more likely the parents to assert their own authority. I can be loving, but I'm still in charge with the kids. These are things we know children desperately need. All the psychological research has shown this since the 1960s. Authoritative, meaning loving, rule-bound parenting is the best for kids, mental health, success in life, all kinds of things, even relationship with their parents. But the other thing is conservative parents tend to be less willing to hand over their parenting to a mental health expert.
So they're less willing to employ therapists of all kind. I guess what's even more insidious, though, as you say, is there's one thing paying a lot of money. I mean, let's re-emphasize this again. Weekly therapy is very expensive. There's a difference between that and the kids getting access to these services in schools. A conservative parent's more likely to resist if there are moves towards giving children therapy in schools.
I mean, we'll see there. What they're trying to do now is the mental health industry is suggesting that the kids need therapy everywhere. Everyone needs therapy is the idea in the United States. And this could only ever help, right? So they're bringing it into every school. And there's all the mental health staffs have expanded rapidly in the last 10 years. And they're bringing in these mental health techniques or allegedly, mental health techniques like social emotional learning. We're going to teach you how to be emotionally regulated. And of course, you can't teach emotional regulation in a class. Actually, it's a ludicrous idea. And I talked to a neuropsychologist who backed that up, that there are certain kinds of life skills that you get through life. How do you learn emotional regulation? You suffer through disappointment and learn that you're going to be fine. And then the next time you're dumped, it doesn't seem so bad. You've been there before. But sitting around with your teacher talking about a time when you are in pain, yes, it may lower your mood, but it does nothing to prepare you to handle pain. Why? Because you have to be cut from the basketball team to know that you'll survive it. You have to. And there's no short circuiting of it.
You speak to some experts who talk about, again, very counterculturally, the importance of emotional repression. The fact that sometimes you will have bad feelings, you have bad things happen to you, and the way that you have to respond is to get on with it and not ruminate and not make a fuss and so on. And that this is something that children have to learn through those bad experiences. And I was reflecting on the fact that it's this funny kind of contradiction within the political, whatever we want to call it, the kind of liberal progressive political view, which both massively endorses the mental health industrial complex, but also there's a suite of other things, not least transgenderism, which was the subject of your last book. And it occurred to me that they insist on emotional repression in some instances. So, like, for instance, if you feel uncomfortable because there's someone who you regard as a man in the girls' bathroom,
right?
You're not allowed to be distressed by that. That's not trauma, right? You got to suppress that. Or if you're like worry, if you're tempted to cross the street because you're worried by a man, like if he's black, you can't do that. You have to, you know what I mean? Like there are various ways in which whatever that ideology teaches young people to suppress their instincts, their emotions, their distress. But then in other areas, you're supposed to constantly kind of divulge and express
That's a
and even
brilliant point.
exaggerate.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. I wish I had thought about it. I didn't include that in the book, but it's a brilliant point. No one else has made that. That of course we expect repression in all kinds of areas of our lives, right? You're not allowed to cry out when you're on the girls' swim team and a biological man just marched into your locker room to change. You're not allowed to cry out when he steals your trophies. That's considered bad form. That you have to repress. You're right. It's totally inconsistent. But what I wrote about in the book, I avoided politics in the book for a reason. First of all, everybody's written about it already. But second of all, and I try not to write about things everybody knows. But second of all, I thought it was really interesting that this went against what we know psychologically to be good, which is that a certain amount of repression of your pain is part of a healthy life. Now, let me just say, I'm always sheepish telling a British audience this because they are the last people that needs to know. So I say this with a good deal of embarrassment because I certainly don't need to tell the British people that a fair amount of repression and stiff upper lip is an important part of a healthy life. But I suppose I just offer it as further evidence or further encouragement that of course you're right about that.
You do need to remind us because we've had, I mean, it's one of the interesting factors with the Prince Harry and Meghan Markle kind of ongoing storyline, which I'm sure you see some of in America, where Meghan Markle is bringing with her this extraordinarily Californian, you know, no insult to Californians, but extraordinarily Californian attitude towards mental health and constant disclosure, and like really doesn't like stiff upper lip at all. And of course, that's completely in contrast to the traditional royal family attitude towards this, and that's been so much of the source of conflict within the royal family.
I mean, it's hilarious. First of all, you should know, and I'm sure you've heard this, that our fascination with the British royal family way exceeds yours.
Okay,
So
I don't
we
need
are
to be
very
okay.
aware. We are very aware and we are utterly mesmerized. Yes, you really do see that amazing contrast between, the idea that we have to be overly sensitive to every comment. I mean, the number of people who have said to me that, who are darker skinned, who have said to me, my parents would have said the same thing, or my son would have said same thing. I wonder what color the baby will be, or something insensitive like that. I would have heard that from my grandparents, and I'm not African American. I'm just darker skinned. And the idea that they're going to bring this, that she's going to teach Harry how to get in touch with his pain. And he live streamed a session with Gabor Mate in which they were discussing his emotional injuries. Look, I'm not saying, he lost his mother as a child. I'm not saying he hasn't gone through hard times. I think it's fair to say that we've all gone through hard times, which doesn't mean that, I'm not comparing, a parent's divorce to, a child who was sexually abused repeatedly as a child. I mean, there's degrees and whatnot, but the notion that we need therapists to cure every American child, well, first of all, we really should be very careful about treating the well. Because when you're treating someone who's healthy, not someone who's suffering from a traumatic incident, but someone who's on their way to recovery, which is the norm, most people will be resilient in the face of hardship. When you go in there and tell a child, no, you've been traumatized and now we're going to talk about it endlessly, you're very likely to introduce psychopathology where there wasn't.
I remember it's another contradiction within the sort of the therapeutic worldview, where I think there are a lot of ways, and I guess I'm to bring politics back into it. I'm saying this from a more conservative perspective. I think there are a lot of ways in which our culture isn't very good for children, right? I think that we, for instance, a culture of divorce is not good for children generally. Pornification is not good for children. I've written about this obviously at length. There are a lot of facets of the sort of hyper-progressive suite of like social changes which are not good for children. And then at the same time, that's coupled, maybe it's like necessarily coupled with this hyper focus on child trauma and on gentle parenting, which I'm sure we're going to get onto. And it's like simultaneously we're hurting children and then we're also being overprotective of them. And it seems as if actually that combination is almost the worst of both worlds, that it would be better to have social structures that were good for children, but then not to encourage this interrogation of their feelings all the time.
Yes, I would even go further, and I take no pleasure in this. I love America. I mean, it's my country. It brings me no pleasure to say this, but I believe our culture is toxic for children, and I don't use that term lightly. I mean that it is absolutely injurious to children in a whole bunch of ways. I mean, we know that our immigrants to America they call this a paradox, but our immigrants to America tend to have better mental health no matter what their socioeconomic level, than native born Americans. And the more those people acculturate, the worse their kids' mental health gets. And the reason is because in America, we're living in isolation from families. We're telling children that they never have to consider anyone's feelings but their own, which reaffirms for a child the sense that they are alone in this world. Because if you burden them with someone else, a responsibility to others, to be a good citizen, you actually let them give them purpose. See, it's not actually a burden to be told, don't scream. I tell the story in this book of these two little girls. One screamed her head off in the plane I was on the airplane. She was seated in front of me with her parents. And her very gentle father said to her, "What's wrong, honey?" She was about probably 7 years old. "What's wrong?" "Oh, your sister did that." "All right, well," and he's trying to calm her down and she is screaming. And what was so interesting to me, and I was shocked by, is he asked about her feelings, what caused it. He asked her what he could do. He never once mentioned the other passengers on the plane. He never troubled her with thoughts of the rest of us. And I brought this up to a wonderful woman who's runs the emotions lab at Georgetown University. And I asked her, she's a cross-cultural psychologist, and I asked her, what would other cultures think of this? And she basically said they would think that was bananas. Because in more collectivist versus our individualist culture in the West, and a more collectivist culture, you're always been told to think about the community, your neighbors, the people you're connected to. And that gives you a wonderful sense of strength and stability in life, knowing that there are people who matter and you matter to them too. That's the thing. But we're doing the opposite. We're always telling kids they are so unique, so bespoke. They never need to trouble themselves with anyone else.
Yeah, I think the individualism is absolutely incredible. And really, I mean, American individualism is descended from British individualism. It's kind of an exaggerated version of it, but British people started breaking away from traditional sort of clannish communities earlier than anyone else. It's clear it's got a long history, right? This move away from communitarianism. It's so good for the economy. It's so good for innovation. It's so good for entrepreneurialism. Like there are so many advantages to this mode of society. It is so bad generally though for people's brains. Like it seems to generate a lot of misery. So you have this paradox in America and elsewhere of kids on the one hand being so materially well off, never having to worry about disease or hunger or anything, and then also being absolutely miserable.
Yeah, I mean, somebody was from the UK press asked me about. She said basically, "Oh, they're not going to like hearing you talk about this, the need for extended family, because we have this, radical gender, community, the radical gender ideologues and trans activists, whatever you want to call them, and they really push the idea that you can make up a family and your family is the people who share your politics or your LGBTQ we are your rainbow family."
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't care if they like it. It's not true. So the Harvard Grant study is one of the longest studies in existence on human happiness. And I think it goes 75 years even. It's very, very long term. And they looked at what makes people, it's a prospective study. They followed people and they wanted to know what makes people happy over a lifetime. And they looked at, there were 5 traits that they found, including a certain amount of repression, people who were able to put aside their emotions and people who were able to sort of put a happy or positive cast on things, not sort of the opposite of revisiting their pain endlessly. But the other thing was one researcher summed up the results as people who you love and love you back over a lifetime, stable relationships going from childhood all the way through your life, make you feel like I matter. I'm connected to somebody. Not because we shared the politics online and we have the same online identification. No, people who really care if I show up at Thanksgiving or what. I know you don't have Thanksgiving, but whatever the holiday. We're not telling people the truth about what, as you said, what's good for kids.
Yeah, unchosen bonds are really necessary to be psychologically stable, but they are also onerous sometimes, that you kind of just have to, like, your relatives will annoy you sometimes. And I think this sort of short-termist individualist culture really encourages people to, well, I mean, you write about this, right? This massive spike in family estrangement, particularly, I think, adult children with their parents.
Well, here's the thing. It is annoying. Look, extended family is irritating. Everybody knows this. It doesn't matter who your family is, right? It's intrusive. They ask the wrong questions. They say the wrong things. Yes, it's annoying. It also happens to be very good for us. See, what causes us some minor distress in the moment sometimes is very good for us long term. And there's this great study, I think it was done by Jean Twenge, of young university students during the pandemic, where the kids came home to large families during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, when they didn't want to be there. They didn't want to be living under mom's roof. They wanted to be in university. They were upset about it. They ended up happier than the kids who stayed at university and isolated. Because being around even your little siblings who get on your nerves, and your aunts and uncles and your parents who are trying to, trying to set down all these rules, even that you don't think you need anymore, and that's better for you than being in isolation. And we're teaching kids the opposite. We're teaching them to spend, endless amounts of time on their phones. We're encouraging them to be in the idea that they're so unique and separable in the world. They're like these little electrons floating around, and it's not good for them. And it's not true, but it's also really not good for them.
The family estrangement stuff is so sad. And the number of people who choose to cut off links with family members who are not abusive, right? This can be like quite a low threshold because their therapists encourage them to. And I thought that it was very important. I was under the impression, clearly wrong, that being that directive with a client was an absolute no-no as a therapist. But apparently many of them don't view it that way.
It's funny, human beings are amazing as social computers. I mean, we're so sophisticated socially. I don't know how many therapists are actually saying the words, "Your family is toxic. You should cut them off." But you don't have to. You can lead a person. The number of people who have told me they've been cut off by their adult children who called them toxic or emotionally abusive, they were always using the language of psychotherapy. And they absolutely came to this when they were in therapy. And, I interviewed an expert in family estrangement who says, and this is a well-known side effect of therapy, family estrangement. Now, you don't need to say much to a kid to encourage the idea that her, mother did something emotionally abusive, right? They'll understand the message. They can merely describe the conduct, or, so they can play within the rules, but lead someone to the suggestion. Now, I'm not saying they're doing it on purpose. I don't think they necessarily are. But whenever, I've been in therapy, whenever you're in therapy, the therapist sort of preside, especially if you don't need it. I'm not talking about someone who comes and they're struggling with anorexia and everybody's focused on getting them, back over this problem and getting weight on this person. I'm not talking about that, because that really focuses the mind. But I'm talking about this general psychodynamic therapy where you're sitting there, the therapist presides over it and just sort of examines everyone else from this perch of superiority. That's very, very common. And you do get the sense of, gosh, a lot of the people around me are emotionally damaged and even pathological, possibly. I mean, that is a common sort of revelation while you're sitting in therapy.
Do you think also that people are absorbing this, even if they're not in therapy themselves, they kind of absorb it from the culture? So vocabulary like toxic, you might read that in a magazine or on social media or something.
That's right. It's a totally steep. That's the point of the book. It's that we're swimming in therapy. We're in an endless ocean of therapy. And I know, they will say, and some try to say, "Oh, the best therapists don't do this." Well, okay. I bet that the best therapists don't do this. I interviewed some excellent ones who will turn parents down and say, "Your kids don't need therapy." I mean, those are really good therapists, but I don't think they're the vast majority. I think the vast majority is just, very much incentivized. And I think they want to help a child. And I think they're motivated by a belief that every child contains some trauma and they're going to find it. And we know over and over in history that a tremendous amount of mischief from the recovered memory syndrome has been made to the trans identification phenomenon, has been made by a therapist sitting around with an anxious teenager discussing what might have been the problem.
Yes, cooking this up to kind of mutual benefit, except of course it isn't in the long-term benefit of the patient.
No, and that's never that unfortunately that's not considered enough. See, you sit around with a young adult and you convince her, or sit with her, and together you reach the realization that her loving parents are toxic because they weren't always aware of every emotional pain she had, or maybe they weren't totally attendant to it or whatnot. You know, you don't I don't think the professionals always realize how much damage they're doing, because having your parents in your life, people who love you, no matter how badly they may have hurt your feelings in the past or wrongly they have handled things, gosh, there's no replacement. There's just no replacing that.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.